Every witness stopped speaking at exactly the same moment. Not from fear, or not only from fear, from memory. From the peculiar failure of memory that occurs when the mind encounters something it was not designed to process. Each witness could describe the road they had been walking. The weather, overcast, a light drizzle in 2 cases, dry and still in 3 others. The hour, late afternoon, the kind of light that makes shadows stretch longer than they should. Even the smell of the air, damp earth, pine resin, the faint iron tang of distant rain. Details crisp as frost. But when they reached the figure they had seen, silence swallowed every word. The first account came from Daggerford. A merchant, silk primarily, with some spice on the side, had been traveling north toward Waterdeep when his horses stopped. Not slowed. Stopped, as though they had hit an invisible wall. "I have driven these horses for 7 years," he wrote. "They have charged through thunderstorms. They have pulled wagons out of mud. They have never, not once, refused to move until that afternoon. They planted their hooves and lowered their heads and made a sound I have never heard a horse make before. It was not a whinny, it was a whimper. Then the cold came. Not the cold of winter, not the cold of wind or snow or frozen ground. A cold that had nothing to do with temperature. The merchant wrote that his breath still steamed in the air. The physical world was unchanged. But I felt it inside my chest, he wrote. Not on my skin, in my chest, as though something had reached past my ribs and touched the place where my warmth lives, and simply turned it off. The second account came from the fields of the dead. A ranger, someone trained to observe, someone whose profession was literally watching, described seeing a figure walking alone across the battlefield where centuries of warriors had been buried. I could not tell you how tall he was. I could not tell you what armor he wore. I could tell you that every bird within a league fell silent the moment he passed. I could tell you that frost spread across warm stone, not after he walked over it, but before, as though the stone knew he was coming and began grieving in advance. Then came 5 more, different regions, different travelers, different weeks. Yet every testimony reached the same threshold and stopped. I saw him, after that, only unfinished sentences. The words were there. I could see them forming in the witnesses' eyes as they sat before my desk. But something refused to let them cross the threshold into speech, as though describing Myrkul was not merely difficult, but forbidden. A rule written into the architecture of perception itself. I questioned each survivor separately, hoping that isolation would loosen what proximity had frozen. It did not. None contradicted the others. That was not the problem. The problem was that they agreed too precisely on everything except the one thing I needed them to describe. They remembered birds falling silent before the figure appeared. They remembered their own breath growing shallow, not from exertion, but from what one called the feeling of being inside something that was looking back at you. They remembered frost spreading across warm stone, and the way the frost did not melt, but sublimated, turning directly from solid to vapor, bypassing water entirely, as though even the laws of physics were trying to escape. But when I asked what the figure looked like, their eyes changed, I want to be precise about this. Their eyes did not dart away, the way eyes dart when someone is lying. They did not go distant, the way eyes go when someone is remembering. They went still, as though something behind the eyes had decided that this particular door would not be opened, no matter how politely you knocked. Only a gravedigger offered a single name. Myrkul. He was the last witness I interviewed, and by then I had already filled 7 pages with descriptions of what Myrkul's presence felt like, without a single line about what it looked like. The gravedigger was old enough that his hands had the permanent tremor of a life spent breaking frozen ground. He sat across from me, refused the water I offered, and stared at the archive table for a long time before he spoke. He whispered the name once, Myrkul. Then he pressed both palms flat against the archive table, as though anchoring himself to something solid, something that would not dissolve when the word left his mouth. He did not blink while he said it. His eyes remained fixed on mine with an intensity that made me want to look away, and a gravity that made it impossible to do so. Before leaving, he begged me never to write that name beside his own. The living can be found, he said. The dead can be counted. But the things that belong to him, they do not forget. The archives describe Myrkul as the Lord of Bones, Master of the Dead, Reaper of Souls. The texts are clinical, detached. They speak of rituals performed in his name, wars fought for his favor, priests who wore skull masks and spoke in cadences that sounded like funeral bells. But every historical account I found described Myrkul at a distance. His influence, his church, his demands, never his presence. It was as though history itself had conspired to avoid looking directly at him. One from a monastery with no words at all. Only a charcoal sketch. A winding road. I recognized the trade way from the angle of the trees. Abandoned wagons, their cargo still tied down, their drivers nowhere to be seen, and a dozen people kneeling in the mud. Their faces were turned upward, towards something the artist had drawn as empty space. The space was not blank. The artist had shaded it carefully, deliberately, as though rendering something that occupied physical space while refusing to be visible. An accompanying note, written by the abbot, not the artist, said, "He drew the figure 3 times. Each time he finished, he stared at the drawing for several minutes, then blacked it out with charcoal and started again. After the 3rd attempt, he set the charcoal down and said, 'There is not enough darkness in the world to draw what I saw.' He has not spoken since. Tonight, for the first time since beginning this chronicle, I closed a witness file unfinished. Not because evidence was missing. I had 17 pages of testimony, more than enough to fill a chapter. But every surviving witness, in their own way, had protected the same silence. The blacksmith who could not describe the armor, the ranger who could not estimate the height, the artist who blacked out his own drawing 3 times and gave up. Sometimes what cannot be recorded is the strongest record of all. A god of death walked across Faerun, and 17 witnesses saw him, and not one of them could tell me what he looked like. That is not failure. That is evidence. The Lord of Bones is not merely frightening to behold. He is impossible to describe. The human mind, encountering Myrkul, does not form an image. It deforms a wound, and wounds do not translate into words. I still cannot tell you what Myrkul looked like. Perhaps no mortal should. But I can tell you this. Somewhere in the chaos of the time of troubles, the god of death is walking, and every living thing that crosses his path feels its own mortality like a hand closing around its heart. Next week, another name begins appearing across Faerun. Tyrek. Unlike the others, he is not feared because he is ancient. He is feared because nobody, not even the gods, knows what he will become.
The Impossible Archive is open. New episodes every week. Subscribe before the next entry disappears.